Is your team smart, talented, experienced, but they're still not performing as they should? Well, then this episode is your playbook to create a top 1% high-performing team. And to do that, I'm joined by Dr. Vanessa Druskat, author of The Emotional Intelligent Team, one of the most important business books of the year. And she unpacks why these high emotional intelligent teams outperform even the smartest groups, and how you can transform how your team communicates, operates, and performs starting today. Enjoy. Vanessa, we all know what emotional intelligence is, but what is team emotional intelligence?
Emotional intelligence is about the individual, right? It's about recognizing that every interaction is full of emotion. So when you're emotionally intelligent, you're recognizing your own emotion and you're noticing others' emotions, and you're adapting that to have an effective interaction. Well, in teams, you obviously have very many interactions simultaneously. You've got people interacting constantly. And emotion is contagious in teams. So we've defined team emotional intelligence as interactions that build a productive emotional environment, one that has trust, psychological safety, and that's ripe for collaboration. So in other words, we're focused on the routines and the norms, the ways people interact habitually that either produce a productive or a destructive, or somewhere along the continuum, environment for collaboration.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I think it's hard to underestimate how important that is for the performance of a team and an organization, right? Because if the team doesn't really interact well, emotionally unintelligent, you can see how that would harm performance in various ways.
Yes, absolutely. And you can't count on individual emotional intelligence having a large impact in your team unless you set up normative interactions. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Plenty of people can walk in with empathy. I think it's a really important skill for leaders to have. But if you don't have interactions, normative interactions, that allow people the time to listen to one another, that allow everyone to speak so that you can empathize with everyone. And also, so first of all, you need that in order for empathy to even be shown. But also, some of our research shows that if you've got too much empathy, if the situation is pulling out empathy from you, then you won't provide constructive feedback. You won't necessarily get into the good friction, the good conflict is a tough word, but the debates or the arguments that help clarify ideas and push them, right? I mean, I have to get smarter and think harder about my ideas when you're pushing me. And if you want that in an environment, you don't want to have empathy get in the way of that. And so anyway, let me stop there. And
it's fascinating. So if I understand you correctly, it's not enough to hire a bunch of intelligent people who may also have good emotional intelligence. That is not the same, or that doesn't necessarily lead to team emotional intelligence. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, what you're aiming at is an environment where people know and care about one another enough, right? And that comes through interactions that you can check that box. And then the leader can encourage constructive interactions. Once you've got trust or psychological safety in the room, you can spend it, right? Yeah. To really clarify and get good ideas and really push one another and build on one another's ideas, right?
Yeah. Before we dive in, I would love to understand a little bit more about the relationship between IQ and EQ. So what does the science say? Is it hard to increase IQ, but easier to increase EQ? Are smart people more likely to have EQ? So what does the science tell us about EQ and IQ?
Sure. The definition of IQ is, everyone knows what it is, that you can measure it easily. People argue about it all the time. I've been to conferences where you have different perspectives in the room. But anyway, there's, as you probably know, Carol Dweck's work on a growth mindset.
Yes.
She started off by looking at whether or not people thought they could improve their IQ. I remember reading her 35, 40 years ago, and her original research was like, can you improve IQ? And if you thought you could, you had a growth mindset. So anyway, there is some thought that you can improve your IQ by pushing hard, especially when you're young. But anyway, back to the difference between IQ and EQ. EQ you can absolutely develop, and I've been part of teams that have worked to develop it in people. But let me just say that EQ requires IQ. So because EQ requires thinking constructively about emotion. It's accessing your emotion. So let's come back to the empathy example. Sometimes I'm too empathetic. It's one of the reasons why I'm using it as an example as I understand it. But I have to manage that since I know I can be that way, especially as a teacher with people coming to me asking for grade changes, et cetera, et cetera. I have to manage my natural empathy. And so I have to, first of all, recognize my feelings of anxiety for the person in front of me, catching their anxiety, catching their, frustration, whatever it happens to be. And then I have to, think about it, use it as data, think about how it's affecting me. So anyway, there's so much IQ involved in EQ that researchers now have to control for IQ when they study EQ. Basically, if you're measuring someone's EQ, you have to also throw in a measure of IQ as well and control for the IQ. And that is so everyone knows that really it's EQ that's boosting your performance and not your IQ.
So as a leader, I wonder, who should I hire then? So if IQ is hard to change, probably. But of course, I want smart people. As you said, IQ is always a prerequisite for EQ. So I hire smart people, but ideally they're also open to EQ development and culture. So how do you think about hiring?
I think about hiring as focused on the task, that you get the best person you can for the task. You got to remember that I think about teams. So I'm thinking about taking a person and plopping them in a team. And my feeling is that if you hire someone who's good at the task, you can build an environment that brings the EQ out of them. That's just how I see it. I work with a lot of engineers. I work with a lot of, academics. I work with a lot of people who have very high IQs and not very high EQs. But I know that if you put them in an environment where listening is required, we're getting to know one another is required, and we're responding to what someone else has said, building on someone else's ideas is required, that it can happen. So back to hiring. That's not my forte. I can't really answer that question. I usually put on the board when I'm giving lectures or running seminars on team leadership, hire the best people you can. Now that you know that, it's the most important thing you do. Okay, now let me tell you what you need to do with the people you hire, because you can't hire for good teamwork. You can only build a good team. We've known for years it's not about who you hire. And there's research that shows, by the way, collective IQ in a team doesn't predict problem-solving success, decision-making success. What really predicts it is turn-taking, so everyone speaks, and the ability to tune into one another, or not the ability, but the willingness to pay attention to one another's needs in the group. And that happens more easily with norms.
Yeah. So how do I facilitate that? You already alluded to some of the factors that will increase team EQ. What should I do as a leader to make that happen?
Let's just come back to what I write about in my book and how I got there. My research has always been about the environment and what the environment does to people. So I've been kind of pushing against the grain of folks who think that you can just hire for a perfect team, or you can get the right personalities, which, by the way, personalities don't predict behavior in complex situations. So what I've been doing is I've been going into organizations and finding out what goes on in the highest performing teams, in the elite teams, in organizations across industries. And so I look for the common patterns in those high performers. I look at the high performers and I look at average performers in those doing the same job. Yeah. And so what I find is, what are the norms? How do they do it? Right. And everybody, when I first started doing that research, everybody used to tell me, well, you're just going to find that they've got the smartest people. The cognitive capacity in the room is going to, surpass the average performers. No, not true. Just didn't happen that way. What we found was that I have 3 clusters of differences, right? I call them norms, which are the expectations we have for one another. First cluster was they got to know one another. And they got to find out what skills, basically built a sense of belonging for each of the individuals, a sense of caring for one another, right? Which can be done without wasting too much time for leaders who don't like to waste time. And the second cluster was that you included all voices in the room, and you had all voices focused on building a sense of where we're going together. What are the questions? What's down the pike that could be getting in the way? So you're building a shared understanding, and you're looking at, proactively looking at problems together, et cetera. I can tell more about that if you're interested. And then the third cluster is about reaching outside the team for new information and new knowledge. And so point being that great teams engage in those clusters of behaviors in those 3 categories. But the first cluster, I think, is the one that is probably worth talking about here because
let's go into these 3. So first of all, we said get to know each other, create a sense of belonging. How important is it that I actually know my colleagues personally, i.e. their private life? Is that necessary?
No. But it is necessary that you know how this person thinks, what their strengths and weaknesses are, something about them that you can connect with.
Yeah.
I like to use the analogy of the sports analogy, or the analogy of musicians, where, you'd never think of people playing, global football, for example, and having to pass the ball to one another without knowing what your teammates' proclivities are, how they want the ball passed, what their mindset is, how they play the game, right? Well, we somehow think that you can put people in teams without having that sense of one another, and it just doesn't work that well. In order to feel belonging, we have to feel being known.
Yeah.
We have to feel known by the group. We have to feel understood, and we have to feel supported.
I'm asking because a lot of people are hesitant to share something about their private life in an organization, right? That happens. So if I understand you correctly, it's not necessary. We don't have to push them as leaders, say, hey, tell me about your private life, what's going on your side. If they don't want you, that's totally fine. We don't need that to create a sense of belonging. Is that correct?
That is correct. I've worked with so many different teams. Some teams, I think of them sort of as more feminine and more masculine teams. The feminine teams want to know, what'd you do over the holidays? Do you have a partner? Do you have children? But the more masculine teams, they don't want to go there. A lot of people don't want to share that information, and you don't have to. So how am I going to get to know you? How am I going to get to know what you care about, what you think about, unless I ask you questions about your work? Right?
Yeah.
So I could say, so Oliver, what was the best job you ever had? What was the first job you had? What do you like most about this job? What are you excited about right now? What are you nervous about right now with regard to our team? What are you enthusiastic about? And so I get to see the way you think, and more. I can elaborate on this more, but let me stop right there. There's plenty of questions you can ask that are focused on the team, that are focused on the work we do, that still help me get beyond my initial stereotype of you.
Makes sense. It allows us to go deep, but the ones pushed to reveal things they're not comfortable sharing. And should I, as a leader, get people in the room and do a workshop around this, or should this happen naturally over time?
Well, first of all, getting people in the room together is getting harder and harder to do. But you can do it on obviously it's wonderful if you can get people in the room. But you can do it online, over Zoom or Teams or what have you. But you can also do it on a daily basis by doing, check-ins, by doing, occasionally just stopping the flow and saying, we're just going to do this exercise now where people talk about what's on their mind with regard to this team or what's going on for them. So let me, my book is full of ideas for how to do this. There isn't just one, but I personally, when I'm getting ready to change norms, or if I'm trying to change the culture in a team, I love to have 3 or 4 hour block where we kick it all off.
Yeah.
After that, it just becomes routine. So let me give you an example. Just maybe I'm sure many people in your audience have heard of these sort of check-ins at the beginning of meetings where you check in. But I think what you need to do is ask good questions in those check-ins. When you first start it, you got to ask simple ones. But my favorite questions, as I've alluded to already, are, what's keeping you up at night? What's on your mind? What are you worried about? And what are you excited about right now with regard to the work we're doing? Or with regard to your role in the work that we're doing? And boom, it takes you right into the emotional. And you start to hear how people are processing things. And you learn more about one another that way.
Yeah. Awesome. So creating a sense of belonging by asking really good questions, getting to know each other. Are you sick and tired of spending 8 hours preparing for a 1-hour presentation? You're not alone. That's why I created my technical guide, 50 presentation hacks. It's for free. Grab it in the show notes. The second point you mentioned was to create a shared sense of purpose, common direction. How do we do that?
Again, it's all about conversation. So it's about bringing people together. And again, by the way, let me just say, this is what I see the great teams do. And they make time for it. It gets more efficient with time. But basically, you bring them together for a conversation around, building a shared understanding of where we're going, looking at what's working well, what's not working well. What do we need to change? What do we know about what's coming down the pike and what's coming at us? What changes are in the next 6 months or the next year that we need to be thinking about? What do we know about feedback from our customers? What do people know that can help us improve? No dumb questions. And so there's 4 norms in that bucket, one of which is what we call support expression, which is letting people know that there are no dumb questions, that you want to hear everything. All right.
Yes.
And that's really important because we now know that, conformity doesn't happen intentionally. It happens when your brain says, the brain sends you an error message. Your brain, literally, the neuroscientists are seeing that when everyone else is thinking differently than you, or no one else has brought up this idea, you get an error message in your brain. And because of our innate need to belong, right? Yes. Back in the day, if you didn't belong, you'd get kicked out of the tribe, you were dead. They have very strict norms. And so those of us who are here now are survivors. Our ancestors were sensitive. Our ancestors paid attention to that and passed that on to us. So people have this, our brains are wired to not want to make waves. All right. Yeah. Now, obviously, there's individual differences in that, but and there's individual differences in the situations that enable it. But my argument is that you've got to continually remind people that you want to hear everyone's ideas, that you want to hear from everyone. You want to hear all ideas, agreements, disagreements. And so what we find is that a lot of leaders have symbols that they use. So let me give you an example. New CEO was brought into a very large hospital in Boston. And his charge was to turn around. They were not doing well financially. So in his boardroom, he brought in a construction cap that he bought at Amazon or something that had lights on it. And you could put it on your head and flip the switch and the light bulbs would go off. So he brought it into the boardroom and he put it on the table and he said, anytime you feel you're not being heard or anytime that you feel we're missing something, and that you really feel needs to be said, there's an elephant in the room, we often call that, put that hat on your head and flip the switch.
Yeah.
All right.
Nice. That can be symbols.
Symbolic.
Yeah, exactly.
Symbolism.
Symbols can be extremely powerful. So sense of belonging, common sense of direction. What was the third aspect?
Third aspect is reaching out for more information. It's having the humility to know that there's information out there that can help you perform at a higher level. So, for example, you can go to leaders in the organization. You can invite them in to your Zoom call. You can bring in their information about how they think your team is doing or what's happening that your team should know about. You can do that. You can bring in experts from the outside. So what I like to work with teams on is to develop what we call a stakeholder worksheet, where we list the stakeholders. These are all stakeholders, people that care about your performance, your clients, your customers, your boss's boss, others in the organization, your suppliers, et cetera. And you listen, you find out who's got information that can help us think better and think about what's happening in the future so that we're ready to move, we're ready to adapt. And that can tell us about how well we're doing and what we might need to change.
Yeah.
By the way, team members love that. They love that.
This is amazing because it seems quite simple actually to do, right? It's not complicated. So these three things, if we understand what norms and behaviors are desirable to make that happen, to create the emotionally intelligent team, it sounds very doable for organizations. Do you think this is spreading as an idea, or do you still think there's a lot of work to be done because some things actually go in the wrong direction?
It's starting to spread. I mean, there's been a lot of writing about the importance of culture, and culture means norms. I mean, culture is built on your daily interactions, and norms are your daily interactions. I think that a lot of leaders still focus on the individuals in the team. I mean, the two questions as a team expert that I get asked all the time are, how do I hire for the perfect team? Who should I hire? And I got to tell you, that question died a long time ago. Researchers keep studying it because it's easy to study. It's one of the easiest things you can study is throw in skills, personality into a survey, boom, 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 and it accounts for a small part of the variance, okay? Culture accounts for 30% of the variance in financial outcomes. Culture, okay? And so what's culture? Those are the routines, and they differ. They differ from team to team. And so back to, is it changing? Back to your question. I'm hoping it's changing. I mean, that's my mission in life, is to get people to focus on, because it's a win-win. It's a win-win for team leaders. Everyone wants to be part of a team where they feel valued and needed and contributing. I run leadership workshops, team workshops all over the world. And when I ask people about their top team experiences, oh my gosh, they have tears in their eyes about how much fun it was, even though it was so hard, because they felt useful and needed and part of something, right? And that's about more than your mission. It's about more than everybody thinks, well, if I just have an emotionally engaging mission. Wrong. It doesn't work that way. My mentor, Richard Hackman, worked with the CIA and the FBI, trying to get them to work together after 9/11 because they weren't working together. And boy, did they have an important mission. And, one of his findings was, once again, that you could have the most talented people in the room, but if they weren't listening and working together, if they weren't being basically caring when interacting with one another because of the norms in the room, then the team didn't perform well. They couldn't outperform simulations of terrorists that they were running. They could. Mediocre people could outperform the terrorists if they were listening.
It makes no sense, right? If you have a bunch of intelligent people, but they don't trust each other, they're standing in each other's ways, they don't really want the other one to succeed, you can see how that leads to really bad outcomes. And in a business, that usually means you make less money. And this is where leaders get interested. So, okay, how can we improve our performance and the people feel better coming to work? Cool. That's a win-win for everyone, which is what you are describing. Yet I hear a lot of leaders, also when you look at what's happening in corporate America, for instance, also in Europe in terms of layoffs, AI is making a lot of roles redundant. That's the reality. A lot of leaders are basically trying to renegotiate the common understanding of the workplace at the moment, in the sense that they're saying, look, you should be happy to still have a job because it's pretty rough out there at the moment. And if you don't like it here, then, well, that's too bad, but this is the way how we do it. So the sort of hard charging culture is a nice to have. I don't really care about this. There seems to be a bit of a resurgence of that. And I think that is a terrible development.
Yeah, it is. It was interesting. I was listening to a video of Angela Duckworth. She's the person who writes about grit. And she was saying, it's interesting to read between the lines. Everybody wants their people to have more grit. That's what you need. Hire people with grit, right? Well, then a sideline, she says, and oh yeah, by the way, what really matters is if they have a supportive environment. Hire them for grit, but if those people don't have a supportive environment, the grit's not going to make a difference.
Yeah.
Okay, and we we forget about the supportive environment and we focus on the grit. And by the way, I want to tell you, I think grit is important. I'm not saying it isn't, but why is it that we're forgetting? The data are so clear. When I want to just come back to my own research, looking at the best teams. We worked with drug development teams at Johnson & Johnson, and they wanted to know, this is how I get into doing my research. They wanted to know, why are some of our teams just flying and, getting drugs out there fast and others aren't?
Yeah.
It's about the environment. It's about the environment.
100%. I think there's a bit of a gap between the academic research. Data is clear. We've been knowing this for years and years, and what's going on in boardrooms. And that's why books like yours, The Emotionally Intelligent Team, are so important, because it makes the scientific data accessible. I was wondering, how do I actually know if my team has high IQ or not? Is there a barometer? Is there a test we can apply?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that I got to tell you that the leader is the last one to know. And I think that this is a lot of the problem. I've been, working with leaders for a long time, and they always think they know what's going on in their team, and they rarely do. And I've talked to a lot of team members at the very high levels of organizations, and I ask them, well, do you tell your leader what's really going on? And they say, oh, are you hilarious, Vanessa? You think we would tell? One time I said to the CEO, your team members are afraid of you. And the CEO said, no, that's ridiculous. Who would say that? And I'm telling you that I had heard that they were all afraid of. All right. So back to your question, which now I'm forgetting what your question was. Okay. So
how do we know?
How do we know? Thank you. So
leaders know last.
How do leaders know? Thank you.
And they know last.
Yeah. You gotta find out. You gotta do surveys. You gotta do anonymous surveys. You gotta find out what's really going on in the team. And so basically what I do is, rather than measuring personalities in teams, which everybody loves to do, and let me say that's one thing that's fine, but you can't do that and then think that's it. What I do is I go in and I measure the norms, and there's a quick survey in my book that I use, and it basically measures. There's 9 norms in our model that we find significantly more often in the great teams than in the average teams. But anyway, you measure the norms, and now here's the key: you don't just look at the average. You look at the range, right? Because the people with status always feel good about the team, because they are really the ones that get heard, that have the control. And that's usually the leader and, a few other people. And you have to look at the tail. What's the range look like? How many people feel like they don't get listened to, or we're not involved in assessing whether the team's doing well? We never ask questions about what we could do differently, and that's because they're having conversations, the leaders are having conversations that no one else is privy to, right? And so anyway, you have to measure it, and then you have to have a conversation, and you have to say, okay, what do we need? What do we need to change?
This test, the 9 elements, where can we find this? Is it on your website, or
it's on my website?
It's on the website.
It's on my website. There's you can download it. We have a thorough test. You can buy a thorough test. I work with people, and we have 300 people accredited in that test now. But you can also just start with the quick one, which I have on my website and I have in the book, and it's a great way to start. It's a great conversation starter. How are we doing now? I mean, this is what I do in my workshops with team leaders, and by the way, we also measure goal clarity and role clarity in that assessment, because that's important.
Yeah,
it's just that
we will link to that in the description, obviously, because that is it's a great starting point, right? It is very simple, it's relatively quick, and then you can go deeper if you want. But that's a great starting point, because I think it's, especially when we want to work on this, it's good to have a baseline, see where are we today, and then maybe see where we are in 3 months once we pay attention to culture and emotional intelligence building in a team.
Yeah, and it's not hard to change if you focus on it.
Yeah,
it's really not. It's we're wired to change our culture. We always do that.
Yeah.
Every team has a different culture. You can change your team's culture relatively easily. So
100%. I've seen it firsthand when, for instance, CEO changes, culture changes from one day to the next. It is crazy how radical a culture in a business can change, even a business with thousands of people, almost overnight, because the new person comes in and says, we're doing it that way? That's ridiculous. We're doing it this way now. And it was like, of course, I always said this. So people want to obviously then, follow the new leader and fall line. And the people who don't like that new approach, they will select themselves out. But I've seen, it is, if you haven't seen this is crazy to see how culture changes overnight once the CEO changes. People will adapt very quickly.
I have seen it. And I've also seen it when we work with teams. Teams that are not doing well, they're losing market share, they're not doing well. When we work with them, it's crazy how quickly 6 months later, they're really soaring. We worked with a leader once who the CEO brought in and said, are you cooking the books?
Sure.
Are you what? And because the team had improved so quickly when they changed the culture. And anyway, I'm not going to say anything more about that. That was not a good interaction.
Let's zoom out. So 30 years ago, first time I heard about emotional intelligence, when Daniel Goleman's book came out called Emotional Intelligence, made a big wave, right? 1995 roughly. And people are like, oh, there's such a thing as emotional intelligence. Today, we take it for granted. We know about it. This is the number one reason CEOs get hired, leaders get hired, because of their emotional intelligence, usually. Because they're all really good, right? They're all skilled. They all know how to execute, etc. But at the highest level, it's all about that personal interaction, understanding others, getting things done, in a large group of people. Now we're in a space where we're talking about team emotional intelligence. Now AI is really making big waves, and it is going to change the way teams function, because we are looking at a future that's not far off, around the corner really, where we have teams of people that also have agents, right? And the agents are pretty autonomous. They almost communicate like people. So the leader will have agents, will have people, the people have agents, the agents have agents. What does it mean for emotional intelligence and teamwork and culture?
Well, I think you're presenting a very positive picture of AI. I've just seen so often. I've seen leaders think that technology is going to make their life easier around teams. Yes, your AI bot is going to be there to answer questions. They can help you. You can feed them data. They can tell you what you need to do to build your team. You take that survey. Boom, boom, boom. You can get feed. I've got colleagues that are already doing this with our survey with teams, putting it in there in a team, and the AI bot can tell you, what norm you need to work on, how you're doing, et cetera. But the AI bot cannot interact in a way that builds on other people's ideas, that uses the talent in the room, right? That listens to different perspectives, integrates them with their own knowledge, and adds value or disagrees or has a debate that's going to produce what the response to complex questions, decisions that are make or break decisions. We are giving our most important decisions these days to teams, and rightfully so. Individuals, it's fascinating. We've had 2 Nobel Prize winners. These are social scientists, Nobel Prize in economics, that both said individuals are biased in their thinking. We are biased. We are smarter in teams. And the bots are not going to do that for us. The bots can help tell us where we're going wrong, can tell us what we need to do to improve, but they can't have those conversations that are going to produce the innovations and keep us ahead of our competition. That's my strong opinion.
Makes total sense. I think what I'm getting at is that teams are getting more complex because we have this interaction between technology, AI agents, and real humans and leaders, which seems to suggest that emotional intelligence and team will only become more important.
Yes.
Right? Because the teams will do less doing, but will do more of the creative, the innovative work. There's a lot of pressure to innovate faster, but the actual doing, the accounting, the coding, what used to be called hard skills back in the old times when we want soft skills and hard skills, that is being done by AI. So what is left is more the emotionally intelligent work.
The interaction.
The interaction to move innovation, to move the business forward, to see around the corner, to interact with customers, etc. Not on that transactional, back and forth level, but really understand what's going on and making that happen quickly among lots of people in an organization.
Yes. Okay, then we're on the same page.
Yeah.
That is exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Which is that the simple rote stuff we can program, or we can get our AI bots to do, but the interactions. And by the way, every interaction is an exchange of emotion, and this is what we first discovered with Dan Goleman and Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer, all the folks that were in it, 30 years ago, or wherever it was. Every interaction, and when I send emotion to you, you send it back to me, and where we go with the discussion depends so much on the trust that we can build in those interactions, and whether or not I feel like I can disagree with you without harming the relationship, right?
Yeah.
And again, this comes back to context. And here's the issue. When we feel nervous, too nervous, we need a little bit of nervousness is good for us. We can't think properly. And we prioritize different things than we do when we're just feeling homeostatic, feeling part of the conversation, getting into a flow state in this conversation. If I have to worry about you or the team or my boss, I'm sorry. That's what I see in average performing teams. Yeah. It's fascinating. I used to get in trouble because of the way I used to describe high performing teams. People used to say, no, they don't yell at each other that much. I used to say, oh my gosh, you're not in the rooms that I'm in with. It's not necessarily the yelling. It's the emotions that they allow in the room, and they still take care of one another. They do. They know one another well enough to. So I can yell at Oliver, but you can't yell at Vanessa. You'll crush her. Back to this knowing one another.
Yes. I love that. I love that, knowing each other and creative friction. That is all great, but it can't undermine trust. And if I inverse this, we live in a low trust world, right? Trust is low across the board, organizations, governments, media, etc. So if you are a trustworthy team that trusts each other, knows each other, has a common sense of purpose, direction, etc., of course, that's a huge competitive advantage. How could it be otherwise? So I love that notion. Vanessa, so good. I really appreciate you and all the work you're doing, because this is so important today, but also going forward with the arrival of AI as our teammates, which is happening as we speak. There's always my last question. What's your best piece of communications advice?
My best piece, I'm going to relate it to a team, and I just want to come back to what you just said, which I think leaders forget that in teams, it's all about the communication within the team. It's how people communicate with one another. And you can set that with routines, right? You can set that with your expectations. And so my advice is to remember that it's not only about you and your team, it's about how they interact together. They need to ask one another questions more often. They need to listen and ask questions and follow-up questions. And, when you're not trying to one-up one another, when you're not thinking about what you're going to say that's going to be smarter than the next person, but when you're really listening, you get magic happens in teams. And so communication advice, get your team members talking to one another and listening, make that a norm.
Make listening the norm rather than
make
talking.
Listening and follow-up questions norm.
Exactly. And don't assume you know what the other person thinks and will say. I think that is a common mistake we all tend to make, right? Just assuming, that person comes from that direction and will say X, Y, and Z, so I don't really have to listen. I think about my response. That's a terrible idea. I think the best leaders, the best communicators, they truly listen and then respond.
Yes. And that happens in supportive environments. Okay? So I can't emphasize that enough, that we don't teach leaders how to build those supportive environments. It doesn't take that much time. But anyway, there's a lot more in my book that tells you how to do it. And I think that's the value added of my book, is that I feel like I've cracked the code, and I'm teaching leaders how to build trust, how to build safety. And that really matters in a team.
Yeah. Vanessa, thank you. The Emotionally Intelligent Team out now. Get a copy. I loved it. I learned a lot from it, and it's also entertaining. There's lots of great storytelling in it. So thank you, Vanessa. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you. My pleasure to be here. My pleasure.